Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Talking Feds one-on-one. As many of you may have heard, Iran's president, Elbrahim Raisi, the so-called Butcher of Tehran, responsible for the execution of thousands of political prisoners and other crackdowns during the 2022 protests, died unexpectedly and suddenly in a helicopter crash at the beginning of the week last Sunday. And I wanted to try to get a bead on what that portends for Iran, for the region, for the U.S., for the world. And to do that, we're really privileged to welcome Reuel Marc Gerecht, who is a former Iranian-targets officer in the CIA, now a resident scholar at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He's the author of multiple books on the topic, and as well as a couple important articles, either by him or with his strong participation of late in the Free Press, the New York Times. Reuel, thanks very much for joining.
My pleasure.
Can we just start here, because other listeners are probably like me, who have a vague sense of this ruling triumvirate with some kind of religious authority being paramount in Iran, but don't exactly have a sense. How is power in Iran divided, and what's the specific role of the president, Raisi, who was just killed?
Well, to put it simply, I mean, he was utterly subordinate to the Supreme Leader. The reason he was advanced to the presidency was because he had proven himself over the decades of being a good minion factotum for the president. He did those things that were necessary. He developed quite a skill set in the judiciary, which is largely used to punish dissidents and to thwart threats to the regime. So he has a fairly accomplished dark past. I think it's fair to say he was a blunt instrument.
Yeah. And what's the formal relationship between the president and the Supreme Leader? And, how is power at least technically, nominally distributed?
Technically, the president is in charge of the government, and the Supreme Leader is the all-powerful force up above. But what has actually happened is that since Khamenei became the Supreme Leader in 1989, gradually he has created the office of the Supreme Leader, which has expanded to now it essentially is a shadow government. So there are branches inside of the Supreme Leader's office that oversee basically everything that the government does, not with the same manpower, but with the possibility of always intruding. And increasingly, the president, he doesn't have a lot of independent authority. The Supreme Leader sometimes uses the president to take the blame. And at times, the Supreme Leader and the president have been in tension. This has been particularly true in the past. It's with President Hassan Rouhani, who was very close to the Supreme Leader at one time. They fell out. Khatami, the reformist cleric, Mohammed, who won in 1997, they truly fell out in 1999. Ahmadinejad, the first populist, lay populist to become president of Iran, he really went south because he started attacking the clergy. So, and Rafsanjani, the man who made Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, the man who actually made Khamenei the Supreme Leader, they were very close at one time. They completely fell out, and indeed, the Supreme Leader more or less squashed him. So,
all right. Well, so let me keep going with this just a little bit more, and then move to the contemporary situation. But so the Supreme Leader's first is supreme, and a call from them to anyone in the country is going to be probably bad news. But the supremacy inheres in some kind of religious authority. Is there a sense in which the Supreme Leader is considered, as in some countries, sort of imbued by divine insight, or a direct kind of channel from celestial sources, or it's really just They're
Well, I
supreme,
mean,
and they have
it's an
jurisdiction
excellent
over
question.
religion too.
I
Yeah.
think it's an excellent question. In 1989, when he assumed the office, I think Khamenei was humble and quite shocked that it happened. He certainly didn't anticipate himself becoming the supreme leader. With time, I think it's fair to say that he has seen his power, in some sense, derived from Almighty God. Now, and Shiism is a complicated religious tradition, but
Right.
there certainly is a long track record of clerics seeing themselves, usually through their understanding of the holy law. But with a supreme leader, it's more complicated than that, is seeing themselves as emissaries of the Almighty. They're not messengers, they're not prophets, but they do think of them. I think Khamenei thinks of himself as being imbued with a divine mission. Put it that way.
Okay, and my sense is that very much when heads butt, that it's got something to do with disagreements there. Let me I do want to take time to expand on your legacy of Raisi, but you draw a really interesting contrast between the kind of official, sober international reaction, which is full of the sort of diplomatic bromides of, oh, we're so sorry, etc., and what you portray in the streets of Iran, which has had a fairly robust, if continually squashed, tradition of dissent for many years. As kind of excitement on social media and passing out of candy in the street. So do you have a sense, I'm sure it's a complicated question, but of the reaction within the country of the regular Iranians to the death of Raisi?
I think it's fair to say that with every decade of the Islamic Republic, the regime has lost another layer of society. And I don't think today even the base of the Islamic Republic, what the regime itself believes its loyal base is, is the urban poor. I suspect they aren't terribly reliable.
Is the loyal base.
The regime
Yeah.
considers the urban poor to be their loyal base. I think that estimation is wrong, and I think the regime itself is fairly cognizant of how its popular support has eroded significantly with time, and I think they are aware that they can only possess a minority of those in the country. Now, I think they have enough young men who are loyal to the regime for a variety of reasons to maintain control. But they are well aware that the vast majority of people have gone somewhere else with their loyalties. And that makes them actually meaner. And because they are aware of it, unlike the Shah, who I think largely by the late 1970s was flying blind, they're actually more adept at squashing opposition.
Yeah. It's interesting, the whole cohort of younger people who you might think of in American terms, whatever, as being more liberal or freedom seeking, but apparently not in.
Well, no, I think in Iran that the university educated have gone into opposition. Yeah. I think they were the first layer of society to actually fall away from the Islamic Republic. But there is a stratum of young men who are profoundly religious or have politicized their religion. It's always difficult to separate these things, that are loyal to the regime and willing to beat other young people. In particular, in the last demonstrations, were willing to beat young women, which is quite something, to maintain regime authority.
For which reason your perception is, however widespread the general opposition to the regime is. You do not see it as in the cards, even, in a 20-25% kind of way, that the death of Raisi is a potential trigger for extra-legal revolutionary change.
I mean, I doubt it, in that the regime recently squashed the Women Life Freedom Movement, and it did it quite brutally. It did something that it had never done before. It poisoned young girls in schools to send a message to their parents. So, I mean, it proved a fair degree of ruthlessness. I'm skeptical whether the Iranian people are willing to go back out and get hit again. I mean, it's sad to say, but I mean, the Iranians, that is, I should say, the Persians,
Right.
who represent probably about 40 to 50% of the population. They have not,
and by and large, very educated, just distinguish themselves from Arabs in general. And it's a.
Well, I mean, the Iranian society is fairly well educated. Universities actually became more common during the Islamic Republic. I think standards certainly dropped since the Shah's time, but the proliferation of higher education. No one believes in the elections anymore. A reason that you had massive demonstrations in 2009 in the Green Movement, a pro-democracy movement, is that you still had Iranians who believed that they could use the system in place to change the government through elections. Since then, the regime has taken control of elections, and everybody knows they're rigged.
So what happened in 2022?
The Supreme Leader chose Raisi, and then it was simply affirmed in an election that,
No, but I mean, there was unrest then, was there not? Bona fide, notwithstanding your supposition about,
well, that was with the unexpected spark, and the regime has lived in fear of the unexpected spark since the death of Khomeini in 1988. And that is, I mean, in this case, it was the young Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, who had gotten killed in custody for not wearing proper hijab. And it sent off a rocket. First, it started in the Kurdish community, and then it spread until it became a popular movement where, in particular, young girls protesting. And the regime was, I think, confounded for a while on how to deal with it, because they knew that if they were to kill young women in numbers, that meant young men were to come onto the streets to defend them. And that would be the nightmare scenario. You'd have more people demonstrating than the regime's security forces could put down. But again, you have to pay credit where credit is due. I think the regime handled it pretty intelligently and with selective ruthlessness. So they were able to squash it. I don't think you're going to generate much. I don't think Raisi's replacement, the next so-called election, is probably going to generate the level of activity. And the regime watches this closely now. They prevent big rallies, that type of thing. That is going to be an engine of protest, but it's possible. I mean, it is now the unexpected spark which scares the regime. It scares the security services. So it's possible. The only problem is, again, they are aware of this. They, amongst themselves, they talk about it. There's a fair amount of information about this. There are leaks from the Revolutionary Guard Corps about discussing what they do with the opposition. So, it's for the regime, it's always a dicey proposition. Whenever you have the potential for people to come out in the streets, give them a reason to protest. So, is this a possible reason? The next election? Yes. Is it likely? I would say probably not.
Got it. Okay, and that's where I'd like to move, who is possibly on the horizon, not simply names, but sort of what they embody. But let's take a moment. You gave us a quick thumbnail of his sort of ruthlessness and sycophancy that is Raisi. But could you give us, a eulogy of sorts or a summary of who he was and his, relationship to the Supreme leader, and what his presidency will stand for?
Well, I mean, to put it simply, Raisi sort of grew up on the dark side. He grew up on the prosecutorial judicial side of the Islamic Republic that, again, was largely used to punish dissent, to punish sedition, to punish. There are a lot of people who have been punished severely in the Islamic Republic who were and probably were loyal to the revolution when they were being punished. So standards have changed. The disposition of the regime to narrow its ranks and to purge itself of individuals suspected of disloyalty has grown enormously. Raisi was part of that process. He became very famous in 1988 for being part of this trial of political prisoners, where they basically cleaned out the political prisons after the Iran-Iraq War and killed everybody. So thousands went down. The numbers aren't precise, but at least 5,000 people were executed. It led to a great deal of dissent within the system. It actually derailed the candidacy of Montazeri, who had been the selected deputy supreme leader. He was exiled, and it roiled.
Is that when and how he earned the moniker Butcher of Tehran?
Yes, that was primarily what gave him the credit for that. He then went on to other jobs. He also established a very, very close relationship with the Supreme Leader. He became in charge of the Imam Reza Foundation in Mashhad, which is the economic power base of the Supreme Leader. It's an extremely rich institution. He would not have ever been given that job unless the Supreme Leader had absolute confidence in him. So he was as close could be, I think, to the Supreme Leader. He was in the inner circle. His biggest weakness, I always thought, is he just wasn't that clever. The Supreme Leader Khamenei, I think, is one of the most talented, if not the most talented, dictator in the Middle East since World War II. He's a very curious fellow. He's a very intellectually curious fellow, and he's quite bright. Raisi didn't come anywhere close to that, but he proved himself in blood. And the Supreme Leader,
I guess that's what butchers are. They're not there for their smarts, but for their cleaver.
And I think the Supreme Leader, particularly as Iranian society has moved into hostility to the theocracy, I think he has grown to appreciate ever more those who are willing to kill for the system.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, the region is almost impenetrably complicated to many people, myself included, but I have learned enough to know not to equate Iran and Iranian society with the rest of the Arab world. Nevertheless, one thinks of the Arab Spring and the possibility held out then for some kind of for political change, making for some kind of political reform, and what you got, in fact, meet the new boss worse than the old boss. So fast forwarding now to what happens and who his successor is likely to be. What sort of, political dynamic and maybe even personal fight is on our hands?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that whoever will be selected will be harsh. That there is no one left in the system that would be
as harsh as Raisi. I mean,
perhaps even harsher. So
but not less. Okay.
I don't think there's anyone in the political system who would be trusted with that job who comes from what we used to call the revolutionary pragmatic branch, which is almost as powerless as the reformers, who are
the revolution pragmatic branch being wusses in the schematic of Iran. Is that what
I wouldn't necessarily describe them as wusses. They proved themselves quite lethal in the past. It's just that they have significant differences with the Supreme Leader, and those differences have gotten greater with time. The reformist element that was best expressed when Mohammad Khatami, in a very surprising election, which was relatively free in 1997, when he won it, that I think scared a lot of folks. It scared the revolutionary pragmatists who were behind Rafsanjani. it scared the Supreme Leader, and those folks were squashed like a bug by 1999. So those groups of people are completely exiled. The Islamic left is exiled. So you have this very hardcore religious revolutionaries who have expressed a great deal of devotion and proven their devotion to the Supreme Leader. And you have the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has also grown in power. That power was given it by the Supreme Leader. So they have a great deal of influence in the system. I don't think it's going to become a military autocracy, but the views of the Revolutionary Guard Corps must always be considered by the clergy.
This seems a little inconsistent with your portrait of Supreme Leader as so savvy and thoughtful. But on the apparently his son is considered a serious candidate to succeed Raisi. Is that right?
I don't know. I have mixed views of that. I don't think dynastic succession has worked in the Islamic Republic. I think there is a large number of folks who believe that authority comes from merit, and that there is, in the Islamic Republic, the only modern theocracy, Shiite theocracy in the world. There's been little evidence that charisma, which is an important part of Shiism, is now seen as a familial trait passed on from one cleric to the next cleric. So right. It's not as if we're talking about
thus, yeah.
We're not talking about the ancient medieval Islam imams here. So right. It didn't work in the past. I'm skeptical it will work now, but it's possible that Khamenei would want to promote his son. It's not clear in his commentary.
His son's 54, and how old is he?
Khamenei is 85. So he would, if he intends to do it, he would need to keep it a secret, because opposition, I think, would grow rapidly, and you could possibly destabilize the system. So it will be a trick. I'm not saying it's an impossible trick, but it would be quite the trick if he can actually engineer and rig the system so his son Mujtaba could actually take over.
Got it. All right. So by and large, it sounds like not a happy or promising event for the freedom of ordinary Iranians. Let's move outside of the country. I wanted to talk about, the Middle East and Iran's kind of bellicose role there. But maybe we should start with the States, because there was an eye-catching remark you made that, there's just no chance, there's no butchery so horrible that it would cause, you think, the United States to stop its, what I take from the way you wrote it, your unwise policy of engagement and, sort of Biden's approach. So first, is that right? Do you see this as not portending any kind of important shift in U.S.-Iranian relations?
No, I don't. I mean, certainly under Biden, I think they're going to continue to try to engage the Iranian regime. The returns may be very little, but if your ultimate objective is to avoid war between the United States and Iran, then you are going to adopt essentially a policy of appeasement, perhaps punctuated with a little muscle. And I think that's what we've seen with the Biden administration. I think the phrase I use is that they would, even if Jack the Ripper became the Iranian president, they would. They would, and I think that's fair. I mean, the senior folk in the Biden administration do ask a very good question. And that question is, why hasn't the Supreme Leader already gone nuclear? Why haven't they tested an atomic device? And it's an excellent question, because I think if you look at their atomic program, they probably should have been capable by now of testing a crude fissile device. And they haven't. So you have to say, why haven't they? I think it's a long discussion of why they keep getting closer and closer and closer to it. They keep building up their stockpiles, improving their centrifuges, but they haven't yet made the decision to build a nuclear trigger and to test a bomb. That the administration likes to look at that, I think, and they go, let's not do anything provocative. So they won't cross that line, because ultimately, I think the administration has already made the decision they're not going to do anything. It's that classic, and I think that's probably bipartisan, by the way, that there is that classic line by the French sociologist Raymond Aron, who said that when a statesman uses the word unacceptable, it means he's already accepted it.
Right, exactly.
And I think that has been the case for the United States under both Republicans and Democrats. It's just more glaring under the Democrats that they don't want to do anything that will lead to conflict, and any conflict could conceivably escalate to where the United States would have to attack the nuclear facilities.
And this is far afield, but I do have to imagine, notwithstanding a bipartisan consensus here, the election of Trump as president, given the personal history of the issue with him, might matter. Let me ask this: it's again kind of inscrutable the role they seek to play in the Middle East and in the region. On the one hand, they're certainly.
You mean the Iranians? It's not inscrutable. I mean, they view themselves.
Okay. Here's what I mean. A little hard for a ignorant person from the outside to understand. So I was struck. They wanted to play enough to send a missile to Israel, but Israel retaliates, and they don't, as people feared, expand. In any event, however scrutable or not their current role is, does the succession of someone from Raisi portend any kind of adjustment to their role within the Middle East, the Arab and Middle East and Israel?
I mean, I think the Iranians view their axis of resistance, which is their sort of grand strategy for neutralizing the United States and Israel in the Middle East, is pretty successful. So I would expect them to continue it. The ring of fire around Israel has proven useful. We still don't know what the denouement is going to be of the Gaza war, but if it ends up in an insurgency in Gaza that lasts a long time, great.
That's all to Iran's in self-interest. Yeah.
Yes.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, Khamenei has been very clear in how he thinks Israel will perish, and it's not through some cataclysmic nuclear confrontation. He believes Israel goes down through a slow war of attrition, where things just become too dangerous for Israel to sustain itself as this sort of commercial technological entrepot, that eventually the best and the brightest are going to leave Israel, and slowly pressure from all sides is going to lead to a decay, and the Muslims in the end of this process win. And I think more or less.
And that's to the good, notwithstanding Iranian rivalry with other Muslims in the Arab world?
Yeah, it's to the good. I mean, the Iranians discovered something. I think they may have known it before, but I think they certainly learned it when the Americans withdrew from Iraq. And that is that, if you take the classical Middle East, essentially going from, Egypt to Iran, 50% of the population is Shiite. It's not this outrageous, Sunni Shiite imbalance, which is what happens when you take the rest of the Muslim world. So they're entirely competitive. And let's be honest, I mean, most Arab Shiites have been thumped on by Arab Sunnis. So there's a lot of ill will there. And that's one of the reasons I think Qasem Soleimani became sort of this icon in the Islamic Republic, even for people who loathed the regime, could like Qasem Soleimani because he was the man who got even with the bloody Sunnis. So the regime has learned to play on that. They haven't given up their evangelical impulse, which is why they always reach out to Sunnis who want to, bury the hatchet.
Evangelical, you mean vis-a-vis other Muslims, to
Correct.
have them see the right way of the
right,
Shiite.
Exactly. I mean, the Supreme Leader in particular less than Khomeini always tries to use sort of, I would call it, Shiite neutral. He's not revealing all of his Shiism biases when he gives speeches. That he sees himself as the cutting edge of an Islamic vanguard, which includes both Sunnis and Shiites. So that's why they'll always reach out to militant Sunnis who are willing to wage war or attack the United States or Israel. They're on the right side of history. That's why he'll reach out to Latin American leftists who use language that looks like his language when he's, when they attack the United States for imperialism. So there's sort of this broad ecumenical approach that the Islamic Republic takes to folks who are willing to ignore the Sunni Shiite differences and focus on the true enemy, which is the United States, and secondarily Israel.
Got it. And let's go all the way over to the other side now, and we can probably end here. But the bad guys, I think we should be happy to call them North Korea, Russia, China. Does Iran? I actually don't know how they position themselves vis-a-vis them before, but are they, in lockstep, joined at the hip and whatever, or do they want to be slightly arm's length and play them off? What's their relationship to that sort of,
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to say the Islamic Republic has been trying since the 1990s to establish better relations with both Russia and China. Even before then, for example, during the Iran-Iraq War, North Korea was a major arms supplier, but most of those arms also came from China. North Korea was a cutout. So there are long-standing ties. You wouldn't necessarily say those ties reflected in the past a burgeoning partnership, which I think is the case now. I think you really do have an entente, an axis that exists between Russia, China, and Iran. North Korea is also in there, but North Korea, because it's crazy land, is a little bit,
as opposed to Russia.
Well, it's a little bit different. But there have been long-standing ties between the Iranians and the North Koreans. And it's becoming productive for them. I mean, China has essentially insulated Iran against U.S. sanctions. So the efficacy of American sanctions have dropped precipitously because the Chinese have come in and the Americans can't figure out what they're going to do with China. So unless we decide we're going to get into an economic war with China, then that sanctions buffer will continue to work for Iran. Obviously, the Russians and the Iranians now have a very tight military cooperation. So this axis is becoming more potent. It's becoming more powerful. There's certain restrictions on the Iranians because of this axis. For example, the number one oil supplier to China is Saudi Arabia. So if you probably have noticed that since October 7th, the Houthis haven't been shooting missiles at the Saudis, the people they love to shoot missiles at the most. I think that's a function of the Chinese deal that reestablished diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudi Arabia, I think, has already sort of rearranged its approach to Iran. It's much more accommodationist than it was in the past. I think the period of the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, being sort of an arch anti-Iranian force in the Middle East is over. I think that's from his point of view, it's a pragmatic choice. He's trying to develop this enormous infrastructure inside of Saudi Arabia, the NEOM projects. There's no way in the world he can do that if the Iranians are going to shoot missiles at him. So Iran is actually, through its various alliances, is in a much stronger position than it was before. There are limitations on what the Iranians can do, but they're not severe. The pluses outweigh the minuses. There could be a recalibration of this alliance when Iran goes nuclear, but I don't think it fundamentally changes anything. I think the common interests of Russia, China, and the Iranians, which is to diminish American power, will hold fast.
So it sounds, we can sort of wrap this up with, I hear two bottom lines from you, Reuel, and I just want to check if I've got it right. First is Iran, in Iran's eyes, doing pretty good. They've got the domestic situation pretty well in hand, and the geopolitical situation improving, and in some kind of long runway where they want to be. That's one. And then relatedly, two, is that the death of the president, as you see it, is not going to be an occasion for any kind of fundamental alteration in domestic or international politics.
No, I don't think Raisi, the process to replace them, is going to likely to be convulsive. If it does anything, it's going to make the regime even harsher. And yes, I think Iran situation, they view themselves as being in a fairly good position. The wild card is always internal politics, domestic unrest. Because
the spark, as it were.
The spark, the unexpected spark, that because the security services in the Islamic Republic really aren't that large. And the Islamic Republic has always been cognizant that they really don't want to use security forces that are raised in the neighborhood where they might have to thump on people. So you always have to ensure that you have security forces that are coming from someplace else in the country to thump on the natives. So the total number that is actually mobile isn't that large. So it is conceivable that if you did have the unexpected spark, that you could have demonstrations that would be too much for the regime to handle. That hasn't happened yet. The regime has withstood so far all the significant threats, and there's been a few, and they've always been able to recover. I think that's a function of the Supreme Leader's cunning and intelligence, and he's actually has a fairly good grasp of what to do when. But he's 85 years old. They're going to have a succession. The succession may, in fact, create that combination of elements that could become quite explosive. We just don't know. I mean, they've only gone through a transition one time, and it was a completely different world in 1989 than it is today.
Reuel Marc Gerecht, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. Hopefully we can check in with you down the line as things continue to develop, and everyone can check out his writings both at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, but in the New York Times and the Free Press as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.